In the unforgiving heart of the American West, a good name was a woman's only true currency. Aurora Hardin had a good name, but she also had 5 shadows that followed her everywhere. 5 beautiful living reasons that made her an outcast. To the pious, she was a burden. To the suitors, she was a fool's bargain. She was a mother, and in a land that valued a strong back and an empty wagon. Her 5 children were seen as nothing more than 5 extra mouths to feed. This is the story of how one town rejected her for having too many children, until a quiet, broken man saw not a burden but a ready-made family, and chose to take them all into his heart and his home. The dust of redemption. Gulch, Nevada had a taste all its own, a bitter grit of silver ore, dried manure, and shattered dreams. Aurora Hardin knew the taste intimately. It coated the back of her throat as she hauled buckets of water from the town. Well, it settled in the lines of her worn dress, and it clung to the hair of her 5 children like a second skin. It had been 6 months since the mine collapse had stolen her husband, Jacob, leaving her a widow at 28. 6 months since their shared dream of a small ranch had been buried under 1,000 tons of rock and earth. Jacob had left her with a strong jaw hands, calloused from work, and their children, Caleb, Lydia, Thomas, Samuel, and baby Rose. Caleb at 14 had his father's serious eyes and a sense of responsibility that was far too heavy for his young shoulders. He tried to be the man of the house, chopping what little wood they could scavenge, and staring down anyone who looked at his mother for too long. Lydia, a quiet and observant 12-year-old, was a second mother, to the younger ones her hands never still always mending a tear or wiping a dirty face. Thomas 9 was a whirlwind of untamed energy, his knees perpetually skinned and his pockets full of rocks and the occasional startled lizard. 6-year-old Samuel was the gentle soul, his large, watery eyes seeming to absorb all the hardship around them, making him prone to coughs and fevers that terrified Aurora in the dead of night. And then there was Rose, just over a year old, a bundle of pure, unblemished life, whose gurgling laughter was the only music in their cramped, drafty cabin at the edge of town. This cabin was all they had. It was little more than a shack with wind whistling through the gaps in the wood and a roof that wept with every rainstorm. But it was theirs, sitting on a small, dusty plot Jacob had claimed before he'd started working the mine to save for lumber and livestock. Survival was a daily, relentless battle. Aurora took in washing from the saloon girls and the few townswomen who didn't openly scorn her. The pay was a pittance. The lye soap roared her hands until they bled. But she would scrub until long after the sun had set, the steam from the boiling water mingling with her weary sighs. The children helped where they could. Caleb would deliver the clean laundry in their rickety wagon, his face a mask of stoic pride, ignoring the whispers that followed him down the dusty main street. The whispers were constant. Redemption Gulch was a town built on a fragile foundation of piety and brutal pragmatism. A widow was a tragedy, an object of charity to be discussed in hushed tones after Sunday service. But a widow with 5 children was a problem, a blight. 5 of them. Aurora would hear from behind a curtain as she walked past a window. The voice belonged to Martha Gable, the wife of the general store owner and the town's primary arbiter of social standing. Mercy, it's unnatural. Like a stray cat with too many kittens. Who can be expected to take on such a load? The sentiment was echoed by others. Reverend Miller, a man whose sermons boomed with tales of fire and brimstone, would often stop her in the street. He never offered food or coin, but instead a heaping plate of spiritual advice that always left Aurora feeling colder than before. "The Lord has laid a heavy cross upon your shoulders, Mrs. Harden," he would say, his eyes glancing over her children as if they were the individual splinters of that cross. "You must pray for fortitude. The community can only do so much. Perhaps you should consider arrangements. There are orphanages in Carson City. It might be a kindness to give them a chance at a proper life rather than this." The suggestion, cloaked in false piety, felt like a physical blow. Send her children away. The very thought was a poison that seeped into her soul. They were not a burden to her. They were her heart, her lungs, her reason for drawing breath in this God-forsaken dust bowl. She would starve before she let them be scattered to the winds. "Thank you for your concern, Reverend," she would reply, her voice tight and level, pulling Samuel a little closer. "But Jacob and I made these children together, and I will keep them together. The Lord will provide." But the Lord, it seemed, was busy elsewhere. The harshest rejection came not from the gossips or the preacher, but from the men who might have offered a solution. In the unforgiving arithmetic of the West, a widow's best chance was remarriage. Aurora was still a handsome woman. Despite the hardship, her hair held its chestnut glow, and her eyes, though shadowed with worry, were a startling shade of green. A few single men and widowers in the town and surrounding ranches had taken notice. The first was a farmer named Silas Croft, a man in his 50s, with kind, watery eyes and a lonely disposition. He brought her a sack of potatoes one evening, and sat awkwardly on the crate that served as a chair in her cabin. His eyes darted around, counting the small heads, his brow furrowed with a look of sheer panic. He talked about the weather, the poor yield of his crops, and the price of feed. He never looked at Aurora directly. After 20 minutes of strained silence, he stood up, mumbled something about a sick mule, and practically fled from the cabin. He never returned. The second was more direct. A prospector named Bill, who'd had a small, lucky strike, swaggered up to her by the well one afternoon. He was crude and smelled of cheap whiskey, but he offered stability. "Look, Aurora," he'd said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "I could use a wife. You could use a husband. But 5 kids, I ain't looking to start an orphanage. Send the older 2 to work the ranches, and maybe the church can take the little ones. You and me, we could have a good life. Maybe start fresh with a new one. A boy." Aurora had simply picked up her buckets and walked away, his mocking laughter following her. Each encounter was like a fresh wound. They didn't see her. They saw a collection of debits and credits, and her children were a debt no man was willing to assume. The loneliness was a palpable ache, a cold companion in her narrow bed at night. It wasn't just the absence of a husband's warmth. It was the crushing weight of facing the world utterly alone, with 5 pairs of trusting eyes looking to her for everything. One blistering afternoon, as she was hanging sheets behind her cabin, a shadow fell over her. She turned to see the most powerful man in the valley, Jedediah Stone. Stone owned the Silver Serpent mine, the very one that had killed her Jacob. He was a man in his late 40s, always impeccably dressed in a tailored black coat, his silver hair gleaming. He owned the saloon, the hotel, and held the mortgages on half the businesses in town. When he spoke, people listened. "Mrs. Harden," he said, his voice smooth as polished granite. He removed his hat, a gesture of respect that felt more like a calculation. "Mr. Stone," she replied, her knuckles white as she gripped a wet sheet. She felt a surge of pure hatred for this man, whose relentless pursuit of profit had made her a widow. "I have been observing you," he began, his eyes sweeping over her, an appraisal that made her skin crawl. "You are a woman of remarkable fortitude. It is a quality I admire." She remained silent, her gaze cold. "It is not right for a woman like you to live in such squalor," he continued, gesturing vaguely at her shack. "And it is not right for a man like me, a pillar of this community, to stand by and watch it happen." A flicker of something dangerous hope ignited in Aurora's chest. Was this it? Was this the hand of Providence she had prayed for? "I have a proposition for you," Stone said, stepping closer. "A business arrangement of a sort." Aurora's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of a new roof of milk for rows of medicine for Samuel's cough. She thought of a future that wasn't a constant struggle against starvation. "I am a lonely man, Mrs. Harden," he said, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "My estate is large, but my house is empty. It needs a woman's touch, a mistress to run it." He paused, letting the words hang in the hot, still air. "I could provide for you. A life of comfort. No more washing other people's filth. Fine dresses, good food, security." It was everything she had ever dreamed of since Jacob's death. But his eyes, cold and calculating, never once strayed to the children playing in the dirt nearby. He spoke as if they didn't exist. And my children?" Aurora asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jedediah Stone's face tightened almost imperceptibly. A flicker of annoyance crossed his features before being smoothed away. "Ah, the children." He sighed, a sound of profound theatricality. "That is the complication, isn't it? A man in my position requires a wife who can devote herself entirely to his needs, to her duties as the lady of the house. He does not require distractions. The noise, the mess. It is not conducive to a life of order." He looked directly at her, his gaze as sharp and as cold as a winter morning. "I am prepared to be generous, Aurora. I would provide a handsome sum, enough to see them settled. The Reverend mentioned an excellent institution in Carson City. They would be well cared for, educated. It would be the best thing for them, and for us." The hope that had flickered in her chest was violently extinguished, replaced by an icy rage. He wasn't offering to save her family. He was offering to buy her, and the price was the 5 pieces of her own heart. He wanted to strip her of the one thing that defined her, the one thing Jacob had left her that was more precious than any silver vein. She looked from his polished boots to his smug, assured face. She looked over at her children, Caleb watching with suspicion, Lydia with fear, Thomas with blissful ignorance as he chased a beetle. She saw their smudged faces, their patched clothes, their fierce, tenacious love for one another. They were not distractions. They were her life. Aurora dropped the wet sheet into the dirt. She lifted her chin, and when she spoke, her voice did not tremble. It rang with the clarity of forged steel. "Mr. Stone," she said, "my children are not a complication. They are not distractions. They are my family. They are all I have left of a better man than you will ever be. You can take your comfort, your fine dresses, and your empty house, and you can burn in hell with them." For the first time since she'd met him, Jedediah Stone looked genuinely surprised. His face darkened with fury, the carefully constructed facade of the benevolent patriarch crumbling to reveal the tyrant beneath. "You foolish woman," he hissed. "You would choose a life of begging in the dirt with those brats over everything I can offer you. You will regret this. In this town, you are either with me or you are against me." and I promise you, you do not want to be against me." He jammed his hat back on his head and strode away, leaving Aurora standing alone in the oppressive heat, the dust settling around her feet. She had defended her children. She had defended her honor. But as she watched his retreating back, a cold dread washed over her. She hadn't just rejected a suitor. She had made an enemy of the most powerful man in Redemption Gulch, and in the unforgiving calculus of the West, that was a debt that would surely be collected. Jedediah Stone was a man who did not tolerate being told no. His wrath was not loud and explosive, but cold, quiet, and suffocating like a snake slowly tightening its coils. The day after Aurora's rejection, the change was immediate. The saloon owner, a man beholden to Stone for his lease, informed Aurora that they would no longer require her laundry services. "Too many complaints about the quality," he'd said, his eyes refusing to meet hers. Then Mrs. Gable, with a look of vindictive triumph, told her the same. Within a week, her meager income had dwindled to nothing. The small trickle of charity that had occasionally come her way, a loaf of stale bread, a handful of withered carrots, dried up completely. It was as if a decree had been passed down from Stone's mansion on the hill. The Hardins were to be starved out. Panic began to set in a cold, sharp-clawed creature that lived in Aurora's belly. The sack of flour grew lighter each day. The children's faces, already thin, began to look gaunt. Samuel's cough returned a dry, rattling sound that echoed in the small cabin at night. One afternoon, disaster struck. Thomas, in his usual state of reckless exploration, had been trying to climb the treacherous slag heap at the edge of the abandoned part of the Minestones mine. He slipped tumbling down the loose rock, and a jagged piece of timber, a remnant of an old support beam, tore a deep, ugly gash in his leg. Caleb found him half sobbing, half fainting from the pain, and managed to half carry, half drag him back to the cabin. When Aurora saw the wound, her blood ran cold. It was deep packed with dirt and gravel and bleeding sluggishly. She knew with a terrifying certainty that if it got infected, she could lose him. The town's doctor, Doc Miller, the Reverend's brother, was a known crony of Jedediah Stone. He would likely charge a fee she couldn't possibly pay if he agreed to see them at all. "Lydia, boil water. Now!" Aurora commanded, her voice sharp with fear. "Caleb, hold him down. Keep him still." She cleaned the wound as best she could with her dwindling supply of clean rags and carbolic soap, her hands trembling. Thomas screamed a raw, piercing sound that tore at her heart. The wound was worse than she thought. It needed stitches. Just as despair threatened to swallow her whole, a thought surfaced. There was one man in town who was not part of Stone's inner circle, a man who kept to himself, who was respected for his skill, but not for his sociability. Silas Blackwood, the blacksmith. Silas's forge was at the far end of town, a place of fire soot and ringing steel. He was a quiet man, broad-shouldered and powerful from his work, with a face that seemed carved from oak. He was a widower himself, his wife and infant son having been taken by cholera years ago. He lived alone in a small, sturdy house behind his forge, and he rarely spoke to anyone beyond the necessities of his trade. He was an outsider in his own way, a man wrapped in a cloak of grief that the town had learned not to disturb. With no other choice, Aurora made a decision. She wrapped Thomas's leg tightly, lifted him into her arms. He was getting too heavy for her, but adrenaline gave her strength, and with Caleb and Lydia trailing worriedly behind, She marched towards the smithy. The forge was a cavern of mesmerizing heat and noise. The rhythmic clang, clang, clang of hammer on anvil was the town's heartbeat. As they approached, the sound stopped. Silas Blackwood stood silhouetted against the roaring fire of his forge, a hammer held loosely in one hand. He was sweating, his face smudged with soot, and his eyes, a surprisingly gentle grey, narrowed as he saw them. "Mr. Blackwood," Aurora said, her voice breathless. "I'm sorry to intrude. My boy, he's had an accident." Silas's gaze dropped from her face to the whimpering child in her arms. He didn't speak. He simply wiped his hands on a leather apron, his movements economical and precise, and gestured with his head toward the house behind the forge. He led them into a clean Spartan kitchen. The air smelled of wood smoke and coffee. He laid Thomas gently on the sturdy wooden table, his touch surprisingly deft. "Hold the lantern closer," he said to Caleb. His voice a low rumble, like stones shifting underwater. It was the first time Aurora had heard him speak more than 2 words. He examined the wound with a focused intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't coo or offer empty platitudes. He simply assessed the damage with a practiced eye. "It's a bad one, needs closing, and it's filthy." He went to a cabinet and returned with a bottle of whiskey, a clean-looking needle, and some thick black thread. "This will hurt," he said, looking directly at Thomas. "But it will be quick. You must be brave." Thomas, who had been trembling, looked into the blacksmith's calm, serious eyes and gave a small, shaky nod. Aurora's heart was in her throat. "What are you doing?" "What needs to be done," Silas said, not unkindly. He poured a generous amount of whiskey directly into the wound. Thomas shrieked a raw cry of agony, and Caleb and Aurora had to hold him fast. But as the initial shock subsided, the alcohol began its numbing work. With swift, sure stitches, Silas sewed the flesh together. His large, powerful hands, accustomed to shaping unyielding iron, were now performing a task of incredible delicacy. When he was finished, he bandaged the leg with clean strips of linen. He then looked at Aurora. "He'll have a fever. You'll need to keep him cool. Keep the wound clean. I'll check on him tomorrow." Tears of relief and gratitude streamed down Aurora's face. I can't pay you, Mr. Blackwood. Not right now. But I can work. I can mend your clothes, clean your house." Silas shook his head, cutting her off. He looked around at her small, huddled family, at Caleb's fierce glare, Lydia's worried frown, and Thomas's pale, exhausted face. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his own features, a deep, ancient sadness. "No payment is needed, Mrs. Harden," he said quietly. "Just see to your boy." True to his word, Silas came by the next morning. He didn't come to the front door where the prying eyes of the town might see him. He came around the back, carrying a small sack. He didn't say much. He unwrapped Thomas's bandage, inspected his stitches with a grunt of approval, and then placed the sack on their table. Inside was a loaf of freshly baked bread, a wedge of cheese, and a small jar of honey. "For the boy," he grunted. "Needs his strength." He came again the next day and the day after that. Each time he brought something: a few eggs, a container of broth, he'd made a handful of apples. He never stayed long. He would check on Thomas, exchange a few quiet words with Aurora, and then disappear as silently as he had come. The children were fascinated by him. He was unlike any man they had ever known. He didn't talk down to them. He spoke to Caleb, not as a boy, but as a young man, asking his opinion on the quality of the wood he'd chopped. He noticed Lydia's nimble fingers, and one day brought her a small, smooth piece of wood and a carving knife, showing her how to whittle a simple bird. He even managed to coax a small, watery smile from Samuel. One afternoon, he found Caleb struggling to fix a broken wheel on their wagon. The boy was frustrated close to tears. Silas watched him for a moment, then came over. "Let me show you," he said. He didn't take the tools from Caleb's hands. Instead, he knelt beside him, his large hands guiding Caleb's, explaining the principles of leverage and tension, the way the wood and iron worked together. For the first time in months, Aurora saw her eldest son look not like a burdened man-child, but like a boy learning a trade, his face alight with interest and pride. These quiet acts of kindness were a lifeline in Aurora's desperate world. They were also, she knew, dangerous. Martha Gable's curtains twitched every time Silas's shadow fell across their backyard. The whispers in town changed their tune. They were no longer whispers of pity or scorn, but of suspicion. "The blacksmith of all people," Mrs. Gable announced at the general store, loud enough for half the town to hear. "Spending all his time at the widow's shack. And we all know what a lonely man like that wants from a desperate woman. It's scandalous." Aurora felt the stares more keenly than ever. They were no longer just looks of disapproval, but of condemnation. She was not just a burden now. She was a fallen woman in their eyes. The thought that her attempts to save her family were destroying what little reputation she had left was a bitter irony. One evening, as Silas was preparing to leave, she stopped him at the door. "Mr. Blackwood." "Silas, you must be careful. People are talking." He turned, his grey eyes meeting hers in the twilight. "I've never much cared what people say, Aurora. But it's for my sake," she insisted, her voice low. "For my children. A woman's reputation is built by her character, not by the idle gossip of fools," he said, his voice firm. "Your character is sound. Let them talk." He then did something that surprised her completely. He reached out his calloused thumb, gently brushing away a smudge of flour from her cheek. The touch was brief feather light, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with gratitude. It was a simple human connection, a moment of recognition in a world that had tried to render her invisible. As he walked away, Aurora stood in the doorway, her hand on her cheek, her heart beating a confused, hopeful rhythm. This quiet, solitary man was not just helping her survive. He was seeing her. He was seeing her children not as 5 problems to be solved, but as small, bright flames to be tended. He was piece by piece hammering the broken parts of her life back into something that might one day be whole again. But she also knew that the more light he brought into their world, the darker the shadows he cast. And in Redemption Gulch, Jedediah Stone was the master of those shadows, and he would not abide another man succeeding where he had failed. The kindness of the blacksmith was not just a gift, it was a challenge, and Aurora feared with every fiber of her being that a storm was about to break. The weeks that followed settled into a fragile, secret rhythm. Silas Blackwood became a quiet fixture in the Hardin family's life. He never announced his arrivals or departures, simply appearing when he was needed most. He fixed the perpetually leaking roof, his hammer blows a comforting, protective sound. He built a sturdy new set of shelves, so their few possessions didn't have to sit on the damp floor. He brought venison from a hunt, and for the first time in months, the children had the luxury of full bellies. His relationship with the children deepened in a way that astonished Aurora. He seemed to understand their unspoken needs, their individual fears and dreams. He saw past the collective label of 5 children and saw the person within each one. For Caleb, he became a mentor. He began inviting the boy to the forge after his chores were done. He started him on simple tasks, working the bellows, polishing finished pieces, learning the different properties of iron and steel. Under Silas's patient tutelage, Caleb's simmering anger began to transform into focused energy. The forge became his sanctuary, a place where he could build instead of break, where his strength was a virtue, not a burden. He started to stand taller, the perpetual frown on his face occasionally replaced by a look of intense concentration. Lydia, the quiet observer, found in Silas a kindred spirit. He seemed to appreciate her silence, never forcing her to speak. One day, he brought her a small, discarded, leather-bound book with blank pages. "A place to put your thoughts," he said gruffly, "or your drawings." He had noticed her scratching pictures in the dirt with a stick. Lydia clutched the book to her chest as if it were treasure, and from then on, she was rarely seen without it diligently sketching the world around her. A wildflower. Samuel's sleeping face, the powerful silhouette of Silas at his anvil. He won over Thomas the wild child with a simple gift, a perfectly crafted slingshot, its wooden handle smooth and balanced. But it came with a lesson. "This is a tool, not a toy," Silas told him, his grey eyes serious. "You only ever aim at targets, never at a living creature unless it's for the stew pot, and never at a window. Understand?" The respect Silas showed him by trusting him with such a grown-up tool worked better than any scolding Aurora had ever delivered. Thomas became a crack shot at hitting tin cans and pine cones, his reckless energy finally channeled into a skill. With Samuel, the sickly one, Silas was infinitely gentle. He seemed to sense when the boy's chest was tight and would sit with him telling him quiet stories, not of cowboys and outlaws, but of the stars, of the way mountains were formed, of the animals that lived in the high country. He whittled a small, smooth wolf for the boy who kept it under his pillow and swore it chased away the bad dreams and the coughing fits. Even baby Rose, who was often shy with strangers, would hold out her chubby arms to be lifted by the big, soot-stained man. He would hold her as if she were made of spun glass, his deep voice rumbling in a soft, tuneless hum that always made her smile. Aurora watched all of this with a heart so full it ached. She was falling in love. It wasn't a sudden, passionate flame like the one she had shared with Jacob. This was a slow, creeping warmth, like the embers of Silas's forge, a steady, reliable heat that chased away the chill of loneliness and fear. She found herself watching for his shadow in the evenings, her day not feeling complete until she had seen him. They spoke of small things, the weather, the children's latest antics, the price of flour. But beneath the simple words ran a current of deep, unspoken understanding. Their growing bond, however, was a secret that could not be kept. Jedediah Stone saw everything in Redemption Gulch. He saw the smoke rising more steadily from the Hardin cabin's chimney. He saw Caleb walking with a new purpose towards the forge. He saw the subtle but undeniable change in Aurora herself. The return of a spark to her green eyes, the easing of the worried lines around her mouth, and it infuriated him. His pride had been wounded. His authority had been flouted. In his mind, Aurora and her brood were his to torment, to drive out as an example to others who might defy him. Silas Blackwood's intervention was a personal insult. Stone began to apply pressure on Silas. A rancher who owed Stone money suddenly found fault with the quality of Silas's horseshoes. The hotelier complained that a new railing Silas had installed wasn't to his liking. Small, petty complaints, but they were a clear message. Silas ignored them, his work as impeccable as ever, his demeanor as stoic. Frustrated by Silas's indifference, Stone decided to strike at the heart of the matter, Aurora and her home. One crisp autumn morning, the town sheriff, a paunchy, lethargic man named Calloway, who served as Stone's errand boy, appeared at Aurora's door. He held a piece of paper in his hand. "Mrs. Hardin," he said, avoiding her eyes, "I have here a legal notice." "A notice for what?" Aurora asked, her stomach clenching. "This here is a foreclosure writ on this plot of land." "Foreclosure? But this land is mine. My husband claimed it." "He claimed it, ma'am, that's true," Calloway said, shifting his weight. "But he never filed the final patent. He took a loan out from Mr. Stone to pay the filing fees and buy supplies using the claim itself as collateral. According to this, he was behind on his payments when he passed. Mr. Stone has been more than patient, but he's calling the debt due." Aurora stared at him, the world tilting on its axis. A loan. Jacob had never mentioned a loan. But it was plausible. He had been so desperate to build a life for them. The document in the sheriff's hand, with its official-looking stamps and Stone's elegant signature at the bottom, felt like a death sentence. "The writ gives you 30 days, Calloway mumbled, eager to be gone. 30 days to pay the outstanding amount, $100, or vacate the premises. $100. He might as well have said 1 million. It was an impossible sum, and Stone knew it. This wasn't about the money. This was about retribution. It was his final cruel move to crush her, to punish her for her defiance, and to punish Silas for his kindness. When Silas arrived that evening, he found Aurora sitting at her table. The notice spread out before her face a mask of utter despair. The children were huddled together in a corner, sensing the magnitude of the new catastrophe. Silas read the document, his face hardening into granite. He said nothing for a long moment, the silence in the cabin thick with unspoken fury. He looked at Aurora's bowed head, at the tear that traced a path through the grime on her cheek. He looked at Caleb, who was watching him with a desperate, pleading hope. "He will not have this house," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "He will not have this family." For the next few weeks, Silas worked like a man possessed. The clang of his hammer on the anvil rang out from before dawn until long after dusk. He took on every job, no matter how small or difficult. He repaired wagons, forged tools, shoed every horse and mule within 20 miles. He drove himself to the point of exhaustion, his powerful body fueled by a cold, righteous anger. Aurora did what she could, bringing him meals at the forge, making sure he had clean clothes, her heart aching for the burden he had taken upon himself. The town watched. The tide of opinion, once so firmly against Aurora, began to show small signs of shifting. People saw the blacksmith's relentless labor. They saw the cruelty of Stone's actions, kicking a widow and her 5 children out of their home on the cusp of winter. While few dared to cross Stone openly, the whispers began to change. Mrs. Gable's gossip was now met with uncomfortable silence instead of eager agreement. Reverend Miller's sermons on charity began to sound hollow, even to his own ears. The day the notice was due, Silas walked out of his forge, wiping the soot from his hands. He had not slept in 2 days. He had $100, a collection of coins and worn bills, tied in a leather pouch. He didn't go to the sheriff's office. He walked straight to the center of town, where Jedediah Stone was holding court on the porch of his hotel. "Stone," Silas said, his voice ringing out, drawing the attention of everyone on the street. Stone turned a smug smile on his face. "Blackwood, have you come to watch the eviction? It should be quite the spectacle." "No," Silas said, walking right up to the porch steps. "I've come to pay a debt." He untied the pouch and threw it onto the porch. It landed with a heavy final thud. Coins spilled out, glinting in the morning sun. $100, Silas announced, his voice carrying. "Jacob Hardin's debt. Paid in full." Stone's smile vanished. "This is not your concern, blacksmith. You made it my concern when you threatened a widow and her children out of pure spite." Silas shot back, his voice rising with a passion no one in Redemption Gulch had ever heard from him. He pointed a finger at Stone, and the whole town seemed to hold its breath. "We all know what this is about. It's not about a debt. It's about your wounded pride, because she wouldn't sell her children for your comfort. You preach about community and order, but you use your power to crush the most vulnerable among us. You are not a pillar of this town, Stone. You are a poison in its heart." A collective gasp went through the crowd. No one had ever spoken to Jedediah Stone like that. Stone's face was purple with rage. "You will be ruined for this, Blackwood. You'll never shoe another horse in this valley." Suddenly a voice piped up from the crowd. "He'll shoe mine." It was a small-time rancher, a man who had often been on the receiving end of Stone's business practices. Another voice joined in. "And mine." Then another. Reverend Miller, who had been watching from the door of the church, stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "The blacksmith speaks the truth," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, not the province of wealthy men with grudges. This family has suffered enough." It was as if a dam had broken. The fear that Stone had cultivated for years was washed away by the tide of Silas's courage. The crowd, once a collection of silent, intimidated individuals, was now a community united against a bully. They murmured their agreement, their eyes on Stone, no longer filled with fear, but with contempt. Jedediah Stone looked at the faces arrayed against him, at the blacksmith standing like an avenging angel, and he knew he had lost. With a guttural snarl, he turned and stormed into his hotel, slamming the door behind him. Silas stood for a moment, his chest heaving, the adrenaline draining away, leaving only a profound exhaustion. He had not just paid a debt. He had fought for them. He had stood up in front of the entire world and claimed them as his own. He turned and walked back towards the edge of town, towards the small, shabby cabin that held everything that now mattered to him. Aurora was waiting for him on the porch, tears streaming down her face. When he reached her, she didn't say a word. She simply stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his soot-stained shirt. He held her tightly, the solid, real warmth of her, a balm to his weary soul. The children crept out of the house and surrounded them, their small hands clinging to his legs, to Aurora's skirt. Caleb stood beside him, placing a hesitant hand on his arm, his eyes shining with an emotion Silas had never seen in the boy before. Pure, unadulterated hero worship. In the middle of their dusty, barren yard, under the vast Nevada sky, they were no longer a collection of broken and lonely individuals. They were a circle. They were a fortress. They were in everything but name a family. And for the first time, Silas Blackwood's house behind the forge didn't feel like an empty memorial to a past he had lost, but the foundation for a future he was finally ready to build. The defeat of Jedediah Stone was not loud. It was a profound and sudden silence. His power, a structure built on the brittle foundations of fear and intimidation, had not just cracked but crumbled to dust under the weight of one good man's courage. He retreated into his opulent mansion on the hill, the curtains drawn tight, becoming a ghost in his own life. Without his oppressive influence, redemption, Gulch seemed to take its first clean breath in years. The oppressive atmosphere, a constant low-grade hum of anxiety, lifted like a morning fog, revealing a clearer, brighter sky. The change for the Hardin family was immediate and overwhelming. They were no longer a shameful secret tucked away at the edge of town, but the quiet heroes of a local legend. They were the center of a story of defiance that the townsfolk told with a new sense of communal pride. Small gifts began to appear on their doorstep, left by neighbors who, freed from Stone's judgment, were now eager to show their support. A sack of flour from the miller, a basket of late-season vegetables from a farmer's wife, a length of warm wool fabric from a rancher's spouse. The most shocking offering came from Mrs. Gable. She appeared one afternoon, holding a freshly baked apple pie that steamed in the cool air. She didn't meet Aurora's eyes, instead focusing on a loose floorboard on the porch. "The apples are from my own tree," she mumbled, thrusting the pie forward. I was wrong, Mrs. Hardin. My words were uncharitable. I hope you and your family can find it in your hearts to forgive an old fool." The apology was clumsy, born of a lifetime of practiced superiority. But Aurora saw the genuine contrition in the woman's flushed face and accepted the peace offering with a quiet grace that left Mrs. Gable humbled. Even the doctor, the Reverend's brother, stopped by, clearing his throat and offering to look at Samuel's persistent cough. "Free of charge," he added quickly. "A child's health is the whole town's concern." But the most profound change was not external. It was in the very air within the small, cramped cabin. The constant gnawing fear, a beast that had chewed on Aurora's insides for months, was finally gone. In its place grew a sense of security that was as nourishing as any meal. The children who had learned to be quiet and small began to unfold. Their laughter, once a rare and precious sound, became the cabin's constant music. Their play was louder, more boisterous, more carefree. It was the beautiful, chaotic noise of childhood, finally unleashed. A few days after the confrontation, Silas came to the cabin in the evening. The sun was setting, casting long, gentle shadows across the yard. He had washed at the town pump, and his clean shirt was buttoned to the collar. He looked different without the familiar layer of soot and sweat, younger and terribly nervous. He twisted the brim of his hat in his hands, a gesture so uncharacteristic that Aurora's heart gave a little flutter. She invited him in. He sat at their small, rickety table, and Aurora sat across from him. The children, who were accustomed to his easy presence, sensed the shift in the atmosphere. Their chatter subsided, and they watched their expressions ranging from Caleb's quiet curiosity to Lydia's wide-eyed attentiveness. Silas placed his hat on the table and stared at its crown as if it held the words he was struggling to find. "Aurora," he began, his voice softer and rougher than usual. "I'm not a man of fancy words. You know that. My whole life has been shaped by what my hands can do, not what my mouth can say." He finally lifted his head, and his grey eyes, so often calm and steady, were turbulent with emotion. "I know what it is to be alone. After I lost. After my house was just a place to sleep. My life was just a way to pass the time until it was over. The silence was the loudest thing I knew. He took a shaky breath. Then you and these children, you came crashing into it. He looked around at the 5 young faces watching him, their eyes fixed on his. You didn't just bring me problems to solve, he said, a small, wondering smile touching his lips. You brought life. He struggled for the word as if it were something new and foreign on his tongue. You filled up the empty spaces I didn't even know were there. The noise, the mess, the constant worry. I found out it's better than the silence. It's so much better. He turned his gaze fully back to Aurora, and his entire heart was in his eyes, an offering laid bare. I know I'm not Jacob. I can't replace what you've lost, and I would never try. But I want to build something new, a future, with you, with all of you. Before Aurora could process the beautiful, terrifying hope that was blooming in her chest, he slid off his chair and knelt on the rough-hewn floorboards. The gesture was so solemn, so profound, it stole the air from her lungs. He wasn't just looking at her. His gaze moved with deliberate cool from one child to the next. Aurora Hardin, he said, his voice thick with an emotion that resonated through the small cabin. I'm not just asking you to be my wife. I'm asking this whole family to join with me. He looked at Caleb. Caleb, you carry the weight of a man already. I would be honored to be the man who stands by your side as you truly become one, to share that weight. His eyes found Lydia. Lydia, you see the world with a quiet beauty. I would be proud to see it through your drawings, to give you all the paper you could ever fill. He smiled at Thomas. Thomas, you have the fire of a Mustang. I will build you 1,000 targets to hit, and a workshop where you can build things of your own. His voice softened as he looked at Samuel. Samuel, you have a gentle heart. We will chase away the nightmares together, and I'll make sure the winter winds never chill you again. Finally, his gaze rested on little Rose, who was sitting in Aurora's lap, watching him with round, curious eyes. And Rose, I will carry you on my shoulders until you are too big to be carried, and then I will cheer for you as you run. He finally looked back at Aurora, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Will you all do me the honor of becoming my family? Will you marry me? Tears were flowing freely down Aurora's cheeks, but for the first time in an age, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She was speechless. She looked at her children, her precious, burdensome, beautiful children. Caleb, her serious boy, met her gaze and gave a firm, solemn nod, his expression one of profound respect for the man kneeling on their floor. Lydia was smiling, a rare, brilliant smile that lit up her whole face and made her look just like Jacob. Thomas and Samuel let out a whoop of excitement, breaking the spell and rushing forward to throw their arms around Silas's neck. Amidst the joyful chaos, Aurora found her voice. Yes, she whispered. Her voice choked with happiness as she clutched Rose tightly. Yes, Silas. We will all marry you. He didn't have a ring forged of silver or gold. His proposal was not sealed with a diamond. Instead, the next morning, he gave her the key to his house behind the forge. It was heavy and solid in her hand, a promise of stability, of permanence. A key to a home. Moving was a joyous affair. Their meager possessions, a few patched quilts, a handful of tin plates, clothes worn thin with washing, barely filled a corner of Silas's sturdy, well-built home. But it wasn't about the things. It was about filling the space with life. The house, once so silent and meticulously orderly, was now joyfully overrun by the chaos of a large family. The clatter of plates in the kitchen, the thud of running feet on the wooden floors, the constant echoing symphony of laughter. Silas, with Caleb working proudly and diligently by his side, immediately began planning an expansion drawing lines in the dirt behind the house for new rooms, a larger kitchen, a porch that would be big enough for all of them to sit on during warm evenings. The smithy was no longer just Silas Blackwood's forge. It became the Hardin Blackwood Forge. Its rhythmic clang was the new heartbeat of their home, a sound of creation and strength that mingled with the sounds of children playing. It was the heart of a home, a place where a broken man and a rejected woman, along with 5 children who were once seen as a burden, came together to forge a new life stronger and more beautiful than any steel. They proved to the cynics of Redemption Gulch and to the world that a family is not defined by convenience or by blood, but by the sheer, stubborn strength of the hearts willing to choose it. And Silas Blackwood, the quiet blacksmith with the gentle eyes, had looked at them all and chosen them completely and forever. The story of Aurora Silas and their 5 children is a powerful reminder that the greatest treasures are often the ones that society overlooks. It shows us that a family isn't a burden, but a blessing, and that a home is not built from wood and nails, but from courage, acceptance, and a love big enough to embrace it all. They found their happily ever after, not in a grand mansion, but in the warm, noisy heart of a blacksmith's home. If this story of resilience, love, and the true meaning of family touched your heart, please take a moment to click the like button below. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that hope can be found in the most unexpected places. And for more stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. Thank you for watching.